Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into something often called the happiness hormone, serotonin, and exploring a fascinating, perhaps surprising tool some are looking at to potentially influence its function, microdosing with psilocybin.
Right. And this deep dive comes from notes and observations you've actually shared with us looking into these
Yeah,
topics.
exactly.
Our mission here really is to pull out the key insights from these sources to get a real handle on what serotonin actually is and does, see how our habits, fit into the picture,
Mhm.
and explore the potential benefits and, this is crucial, the significant warnings or caveats around psilocybin microdosing.
We want to help you see not just the facts, but maybe why they matter and what questions come up.
Exactly. Understanding the so what.
Mm. So right away, the material brings up serotonin, and it uses that common description, the happiness hormone.
But what's insightful, I think, is that it quickly clarifies it. Serotonin is actually a neurotransmitter, not technically a hormone. Though, that common name does help link it to mood in our minds. But thinking of it as a neurotransmitter points to its signaling role really all over the body and brain.
And it's absolutely crucial, based on what we're reading here, not just for feeling good, but for, well, loads of different aspects of health.
Yeah, the sources link problems managing it or synthesizing it or transmitting it directly to things like depression and, well, a whole list of other issues.
Which leads to this really surprising fact the material brings up. A full 90% of our serotonin is actually in the gut, in the digestive tract.
20%, it's huge.
Okay, take a second. You listening? Maybe guess why that might be. Think about what the gut actually does day to day.
Well, it starts to make sense when you think about its big role in, digestion and absorbing nutrients. But here's the absolutely critical distinction highlighted in the notes. The serotonin that's in the gut does not cross the blood-brain barrier.
Ah, okay. So that implies, pretty clearly then, that measuring serotonin in your blood is, well, the source says, irrelevant and very unspecific.
Yeah. Right. It just doesn't tell you about the levels in your brain or, frankly, indicate anything reliable about your happiness levels.
And what's powerful about this, I think, is the shift it encourages.
Yeah.
Happiness isn't just some number in a blood test.
No, it's about how you feel, isn't it? The source talks about your recurring thoughts, your ability to actually enjoy the moment without anxiety constantly buzzing.
And getting good rest.
Mm-hmm.
Which brings us to the next point.
Yes, speaking of rest, the source material makes a really strong connection between serotonin and sleep.
How does that work exactly?
Well, it explains the direct link. Serotonin is a direct precursor, basically a building block for melatonin.
Okay, and melatonin is the hormone that tells our body it's time to sleep.
Exactly. So if you struggle with having enough melatonin, or maybe your body isn't managing it properly, the material describes those really familiar poor sleep patterns.
Like trouble falling asleep or waking up loads during the night.
Yeah, or waking up way too early and just lying there, unable to get back to sleep. We've all been there, probably. But then it brings up another critical connection. Stress. Cortisol.
Ah, the stress hormone. How does that fit in?
Well, melatonin's effectiveness is significantly impacted by cortisol. The material explains that high persistent stress, think chronic elevated cortisol, what it calls hypercortisolemia,
Right.
that actually prevents melatonin from working properly, even if your body is making it.
Huh. So the stress blocks the sleep signal.
In a way, yeah. The source uses the example that cortisol levels are naturally high during the day, when the sun's out, but they absolutely need to drop significantly at night for that really restorative sleep to happen.
And this is where serotonin comes back in.
Precisely. Good serotonin management helps you achieve that kind of restorative sleep, continuous, deep, coherent sleep.
And that's the sleep that clears out brain toxins that build up during the day.
Exactly. The source lists some incredible benefits of this kind of sleep. Regenerating your liver, all your body tissues, even your joints, apparently, and boosting your immune system.
Wow, these aren't minor things. They're pretty fundamental.
Absolutely fundamental to health. So, looking at the bigger picture here, if your serotonin management is off, it's not just about mood.
Right. It affects sleep, how you handle stress, digestion, your immune function. It's all connected.
Very much so. But then, the source material really hammers home this point. Just having serotonin isn't the whole story. Your daily habits, they're critical.
It talks about certain habits being pernicious, epigenetic. Like, that sounds serious. What does that mean?
It's a complex term, but broadly it suggests these habits are damaging in a way that can actually influence how your genes get expressed,
Hmm.
not changing the DNA code itself, but
Yeah.
affecting how your body reads it and uses it.
Okay. And what kind of habits are we talking about?
We'll list things like constant exposure to inflammatory stuff from what we eat, perpetual sedentarism, basically not moving enough,
Yeah.
chronically high cortisol from all that persistent stress we just mentioned, not getting enough sleep, especially at night,
Right.
and even a lack of sort of reasonable contact with nature.
And the consequence of these habits.
Is that they either stop your body from properly using the serotonin you do have, or they force your body to basically spend its serotonin reserves just trying to compensate for the damage these habits cause.
Wow. So it's not just about having the chemical.
Exactly. It's profoundly about how your lifestyle choices directly impact your body's complex ability to use this vital neurotransmitter and all those interconnected systems like melatonin and cortisol. It's a whole ecosystem.
Which brings us then from these essential points about serotonin and habits to something quite different the material introduces, psilocybin.
Yes, a less conventional tool, certainly. It identifies its origin, of course. It comes from hallucinogenic mushrooms.
But the document is really clear on this, isn't it?
Yeah.
It doesn't support recreational use or the high doses that cause hallucinations.
Not at all. The focus is strictly on microdosing using these very small subperceptual doses. So small you wouldn't typically feel them in a psychoactive way.
Okay. And it explains what happens in the body.
Yeah, it mentions that once you ingest psilocybin, your body converts it into psilocin. And psilocin is the compound that's actually bioactive, the one that interacts with your system.
Got it. So the material then goes into quite a range of potential benefits that are being reported, or at least explored, with microdosing.
It does. On the physical side, it talks about potential help with digestion, maybe improving sleep, and correcting what it calls a healthy interpretation of pain.
What does that mean, interpreting pain?
Well, the source uses examples like chronic pain or fibromyalgia, suggesting it might help the nervous system process pain signals more appropriately, rather than getting stuck in a chronic loop.
Interesting.
It also mentions potential benefits for the cardiovascular system and even correct blood coagulation, a wide range.
And then there are the cognitive or mental aspects mentioned.
Right, things like neuronal plasticity, which is basically the brain's ability to change, to form new connections and pathways.
Which could be helpful for it.
The source cites things like potentially helping with tau tics, OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and even improving anger management, making the brain more flexible, essentially.
It actually uses an example for that flexibility idea, doesn't it?
Yeah, it gives that relatable scenario. Like, your plan is set work, then straight home, but suddenly something changes, you have to run an errand. Or maybe the weather turns nasty and tanks your mood. The material suggests microdosing might help with that kind of mental rigidity, making it easier to adapt without getting thrown off course or stuck in a bad mood.
Okay. And then it mentions something potentially really significant. Recent studies suggesting microdosing might be therapeutic for people with autism.
Yes, and this is framed as particularly important. The source suggests this isn't just about neuroplasticity, those changes in connections we talked about,
Right.
but potentially actual modification of neurological structure. Now, the source itself calls this a giant step in understanding, but stresses it's still very much an experimental process.
Right. Still early days,
Yeah,
but potentially profound.
absolutely. But, and this is a huge but, through all this discussion of potential upsides, there's one single point that is just hammered home repeatedly.
The absolute non-negotiable requirement, as the source puts it.
Exactly. Critically important, stressed over and over. Strict supervision by a qualified health professional is essential if anyone is even considering exploring this.
And it's very specific about who that supervisor needs to be.
Very specific. They must be a professional, ideally a doctor. They need to know very well what they are doing, have an integrative and functional vision, be updated on the research, and crucially, have specific experience with this type of treatments and actual clinical practice using them, not just theoretical knowledge.
And the warning, if you don't get that supervision,
It's stark. The source literally says you will have a bad time.
doesn't leave much room for doubt.
No.
Yeah.
And it directly calls out what it sees as a common bad habit. People just buying stuff online or wherever, trying it out themselves.
Seeing what happens, thinking there are no side effects.
Exactly. Assuming it's harmless because it's natural or a small dose. The source strongly pushes back against that assumption.
So the conclusion presented is pretty clear, if it's done correctly and always supervised.
The potential outcome described is many benefits and zero risks. That's a bold claim. But the supervision is the absolute key to that equation, according to this material.
The material even briefly compares this to more common treatments, like SSRIs.
It does. It makes the point quite directly that SSRI antidepressants, the serotonin reuptake inhibitors, can cause much dependence, leading straight to addiction and dependence.
Whereas microdosing psilocybin.
According to the source, when done under supervision, does not generate dependence or addiction.
So connecting back to the overall view presented in the source.
The view presented is that potentially it's really good from wherever you look, and it's always the same, but only always supervised by a knowledgeable, experienced clinician who's actually practicing this.
Okay, so let's quickly recap this deep dive based on the material you shared. Serotonin, way more than just mood, deeply tied to gut, sleep, and our daily habits.
And addressing those habits is fundamental. But then there's this potential tool, psilocybin microdosing, which the sources suggest shows promise for a surprisingly wide range of things.
Right, from digestion and pain perception to cognitive flexibility, maybe even touching on neurological structure in conditions like autism, though that's still very experimental.
But the absolute essential takeaway, the loudest message throughout all the material,
Is that any potential benefits are only possible, and the significant risks are avoided, if and only if any exploration of microdosing is done under the strict guidance of an experienced, qualified health professional.
absolutely. Self-medication is strongly, strongly warned against.
Well, thank you for sharing these sources with us. It's certainly given us a lot to discuss.
It has. And maybe as you, listening, process all of this, here's a final thought to consider. The material really highlights how deeply interconnected everything is, our physical habits, our mental state, our biochemistry.
Yeah.
It also points to how fast things are moving, We're exploring tools now that were completely off limits not that long ago.
So what does all this make you think about the potential ahead? And maybe, just as importantly, the responsibilities that come with exploring these powerful new ways to influence our own health and well-being.
Yeah.
Something to mull over.